The wind screaming down from the high granite peaks of the Bitterroot Range did not care about justice, and it certainly did not care about the woman stumbling through the knee-deep drifts. It was late November, the year 1874, and the Montana Territory was tightening its fist around the land. Clara Hale paused, leaning heavily against the rough bark of a ponderosa pine, gasping for air that felt like swallowed glass. She pressed a gloved hand against the heavy swell of her belly. The child moved inside her, a slow and rolling protest against the cold, reminding her that she was not dying alone. Not yet. She looked back the way she had come, but the snow was already busy erasing her tracks. It was better this way. If the snow could hide her trail, it might keep the men from Silver Creek from following. She could still hear their voices in her mind, louder than the gale stripping the needles from the trees. She could see the sheriff's face, red and sweating despite the chill of the town meeting hall, and she could feel the weight of Mrs. Gable's stare, sharp as a skinning knife. "You are too calm." Clara Hale. That was what the banker's wife had said. A woman who just lost her husband ought to be wailing. She ought to be tearing her hair. You stand there like a statue. It is not natural. It is the look of a woman who is glad to be rid of him. Clara shivered, wrapping her threadbare wool coat tighter across her chest. She had not wept because she had no tears left. She had spent them all in the first 6 months of her marriage to Samuel. She had wept when he drank away his pay at the Golden Steer. She had wept when he brought his friends home to their one-room shack, men who looked at her with hungry, glassy eyes while Samuel laughed and told her to pour more whiskey. She had wept when the silence of the mountains felt like it was crushing her chest. But when the foreman came to tell her that Samuel had been found at the bottom of a ravine, his neck broken, she had felt only a terrifying, hollow silence. And that silence, that lack of performance, was what the town had seized upon. They needed a villain. A poor widow with an accent from back east and no family to speak for her was the easiest villain they could find. Murderous? Someone had whispered. Then the whispers became shouts. Then a rock had shattered her window. She pushed herself off the tree. She had to keep moving. The trail she had been following, an old game track that supposedly led over the ridge to the next valley, was gone. The storm had swallowed it whole. She was drifting higher, forced upward by the topography of the land and the blinding white sheet that fell relentlessly from the sky. Her boots were thin leather, meant for walking boardwalks, not traversing a wilderness in the teeth of a blizzard. Her toes were numb, dead weights at the end of her feet. But the pain in her back was alive. It was a dull, grinding ache that wrapped around her hips and squeezed. She took another step, dragging her left leg, then another. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing at her bonnet. She kept her head down. If she stopped, the frost would take her. If she went back, the town would take her. Samuel's brothers were there now. The Hale family had money and reach, and they demanded blood for blood, even if they had to invent the crime to get it. They claimed she had pushed him. They claimed she wanted the meager share of the mine he held. They did not know she would have given them the mine, the shack, and every cent Samuel ever touched just to be left in peace. A sharp cramp seized her, doubling her over. A guttural sound ripped from her throat, lost instantly in the wind. This was not the ache of walking. This was different. It was a tightening that turned her belly to stone. "No," she whispered, the word freezing on her lips. "Not now. Please, God, not here." She was weeks away from her time. The midwife in town had said late December. But the stress, the running, the terror, it had brought the child down early. Clara sank to her knees. The snow soaked through her skirts instantly. She looked around, panic rising in her chest, wild and frantic. There was nothing here, just black pines standing like sentinels and the gray granite bones of the mountain jutting through the white powder. To her left, a frozen creek bed wound its way down a ravine, the ice jagged and dark. She saw prints near the bank, large paws. Wolf. The fear gave her a surge of adrenaline. She could not birth a child in a snowbank with wolves tracking the scent of blood. She forced herself up, screaming inwardly against the pain that radiated down her thighs. She crested a small rise, her vision blurring. The world was white and gray, devoid of hope. But then, a smell hit her. It was faint, snatched away by the wind almost as soon as it arrived. But it was unmistakable. Wood smoke. Clara squinted against the stinging flakes. There, tucked against a sheer rock face, sheltered by a stand of massive spruce trees, was a cabin. It was low and sturdy, built of heavy logs, with snow piled high on its roof. A thin gray ribbon curled from the stone chimney, fighting the gale. It looked like a dark blemish on the pristine white slope, but to Clara, it looked like heaven. She did not walk the last 100 yards so much as she fell through them. She stumbled, crawled, and dragged herself toward that door. The labor pains were coming faster now, rhythmic waves that stole her breath and left her gasping. She reached the rough-hewn door and collapsed against it. She raised a fist and pounded. The wood was solid, unyielding. "Help me," she croaked. Her voice was a ruin. She pounded again, harder. Inside, there was movement, heavy footsteps, the sound of a bolt sliding back. The door swung inward. Heat rushed out, smelling of pine pitch and curing meat. Clara fell forward, catching herself on the doorframe. A man stood there. He was tall, filling the space, silhouetted against the firelight behind him. He held a rifle halfway to his shoulder, the barrel pointing at the sky but ready to drop level in a heartbeat. He was a mountain of a man, wearing a heavy flannel shirt and trousers tucked into boots that looked like they had walked 1,000 miles. His face was hidden behind a dark, thick beard, but she saw his eyes. They were hard, suspicious, the color of flint. A jagged scar ran from his temple down into the beard, pulling the corner of his eye slightly downward. He looked at her, and for a second, Clara thought he would shoot her or kick her back into the snow. He looked like a man who wanted nothing from the world and offered nothing in return. "Get back," he growled. His voice was like grinding stones. Clara looked up at him, her face pale and streaked with frozen tears. She clutched her belly as another contraction seized her, making her groan through gritted teeth. "Please," she gasped. "I am hurting. The man—" Elias Mercer froze. He saw the shape of her beneath the coat. He saw the way she held herself. And then he looked down and saw the dark stain beginning to spread on the snow-crusted hem of her skirt. He lowered the rifle slowly, his expression shifting from aggression to a flicker of something else. Horror, panic. "I cannot go any further," Clara begged, the words tumbling out in broken, breathless phrases. "Please, just let me give birth. I will go after. I promise. Just let me in." Elias stared at her. He had lived in this cabin for 7 years. In all that time, he had not let a single soul cross his threshold. He had come here to forget the war, to forget the prison camps, to forget the sound of men screaming. He avoided the towns because trouble stuck to him like burrs to a saddle blanket. This woman was trouble. He could smell it on her. She was running from something, and if he let her in, he was letting that trouble in too. But she was on her knees in the snow, and he could see the sheer, animal terror in her eyes. It was the look of a creature that knew it was about to die. He cursed under his breath, a sharp, violent sound. Elias stepped back and slung the rifle over his shoulder in one fluid motion. He reached down, grabbing her by the arm. His grip was iron-hard but surprisingly careful. "Get in," he said roughly, "before you freeze us both." He pulled her across the threshold and kicked the door shut, slamming the heavy iron bolt home against the storm. The silence in the cabin was sudden and ringing. The wind was reduced to a dull roar outside the thick logs. The room was warm. It smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and the metallic tang of oiled steel. Clara collapsed onto the floor, unable to stand. "Not there," Elias barked. He sounded angry, or perhaps terrified. He moved quickly, sweeping a pile of furs off a low wooden chair and dragging it closer to the hearth. He hoisted her up and deposited her onto it. Clara leaned back, her head swimming. She looked around through half-closed eyes. The cabin was spare. There were no trinkets, no comforts, just tools, traps hanging from pegs, a skillet on the iron stove, and a bed in the corner that was made with military precision. The blankets were pulled tight, not a wrinkle to be seen. It was the home of a man who lived with ghosts. Water, Clara whispered. Elias was already moving. He grabbed a bucket and poured water into a kettle, slamming it onto the stove. His hands were shaking. He stared at them for a second, as if they belonged to someone else, then clenched them into fists. He turned to look at her. He looked completely out of his depth. He was a man who knew how to dress an elk, how to set a broken leg, how to track a man across shale rock. He did not know this. "I am not a doctor," he said, his voice tight. "I know," Clara panted. "I just need clean cloths, scissors, and you must wash your hands." Elias stared at her. He felt a sudden, sharp memory of a tent in Virginia, the smell of blood and rot, a surgeon wiping a blade on a dirty apron. He shook his head to clear it. He went to a wooden chest at the foot of his bed and threw it open. He pulled out a white cotton shirt, one of the few he owned, and ripped it into strips. He tossed them into a basin and poured boiling water from the kettle over them. The contraction hit Clara again, harder this time, a vice grip that made her cry out. She gripped the arms of the chair until her knuckles turned white. "The baby is coming," she gasped. "Now!" Elias looked at the bed. It was too far. He looked at the floor. He grabbed the furs, wolf and bear pelts, thick and soft, and spread them on the floor near the hearth. "Here," he said, "it is warm here." He helped her down from the chair. Clara was past modesty. She was past shame. She was entirely reduced to the physical task of bringing a life into the world. She fumbled with her skirts, her breath coming in short, sharp hitches. Elias turned his back, standing by the fire, staring into the flames. "Tell me what to do," he said. "Watch," Clara whispered. "You have to watch. If the baby is turned." Elias closed his eyes. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the scent of pine smoke, trying to steady the hammer of his heart. Then he turned around. He knelt beside her. The sight of the blood, the sheer visceral reality of it, made his stomach turn. But he did not look away. He saw the crown of the child's head. "Push," he said. It was an order. The only way he knew how to speak in a crisis. Clara screamed. It was a raw, primal sound that seemed to shake the dust from the rafters. She bore down, her face turning crimson, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cold draft leaking under the door. Elias reached out. His large, calloused hands that had killed men and broken horses, hovered near her. "Keep pushing," he said, his voice low and surprisingly steady. "I see the head." The minutes stretched into hours. Outside, the storm raged, burying the cabin, burying the world. Inside, the battle was fought in inches. Clara's strength was fading. Her skin was gray, her eyes rolling back. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't do it." "You can," Elias said. He leaned in close. "Listen to me. You did not walk through a blizzard to die on my floor. You push." He did not offer pity. He offered a command. And somehow, that was what she needed. She glared at him, hatred and determination mixing in her gaze. She took a breath that rattled in her chest and pushed with everything she had left. "Shoulders," Elias said. "One more. Come on." With a final, wrenching effort, the baby slid into his hands. Elias sat back on his heels, holding the slippery, warm weight of the infant. He stared at it, stunned. For a second, there was no sound. The baby was still, blue-tinged. Elias felt a cold spike of fear. He used a rough cloth to wipe the baby's face, clearing the mouth as he had heard an old midwife shout once. 20 years ago? Breathe, he whispered. Breathe! Damn you! The baby's chest hitched. Then a thin, wavering cry rose up, growing stronger until it was a squall of indignation. Clara slumped back onto the furs, sobbing. It was a sound of pure exhaustion. "It is a boy," Elias said. His voice cracked. He looked down at the child, at the tiny fists grasping at the air. and felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was as if a locked door inside him had been kicked open. He tied the cord with a piece of boiled twine and cut it with his hunting knife, which he had passed through the flame of the lantern. He wrapped the boy in the warmest piece of flannel he could find and handed him to Clara. She took the child, pressing him against her chest, weeping softly. Elias stood up. His legs felt weak. He backed away, giving them space, retreating to the other side of the room. He felt like an intruder in his own home. He felt like he'd just witnessed a miracle, or a catastrophe, or both. The rest of the night was a blur of small, necessary tasks. Elias kept the fire roaring. He heated more water. He found a bottle of whiskey and poured a cup, bringing it to Clara. "Drink," he said. "It will help." She drank it, her hands trembling so bad he had to steady the cup for her. He cleaned the floor. He took the soiled cloths and burned them in the stove. He moved with a quiet efficiency, trying to impose order on the chaos. He did not look at Clara directly, not out of coldness, but out of respect. She was exposed, messy, vulnerable in a way that made him feel like he should avert his eyes. Clara drifted in and out of sleep, clutching the baby. Every time she woke, she saw him. He was sitting in the wooden chair by the door, the rifle across his knees, watching the fire. He looked like a guard dog. He looked like a man protecting something sacred. Dawn came slowly. The wind died down, leaving behind a silence so deep it rang in the ears. Clara woke fully. The pain was still there, a dull throb, but the urgency was gone. She shifted, wincing, and looked down at the bundle in her arms. Her son was sleeping, his face puckered and red. She looked up. Elias was standing by the window, peering out through a crack in the shutter. The morning light filtered in, gray and cold. It revealed the cabin in stark detail. The dirt floor was swept clean. The pelts were stacked neatly again. A pot of porridge was bubbling on the stove. Clara felt a wash of shame. She was lying on a stranger's floor, covered in his blankets, holding a child born in his presence. She had forced her way into his life, bringing blood and noise into his silence. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was raspy. Elias turned. He did not smile. His face was tired. The lines around his eyes etched deep. "The storm is breaking," he said. He walked over to the hearth and crouched down to add a log to the fire. As the fresh flame caught, the light flared up, illuminating Clara's face and arms. Her sleeves were pushed up. On her wrists, dark purple bruises stood out against the pale skin. They were shaped like fingers. Elias's gaze stopped on them. Then he looked at her face. The split lip she had been nursing was healed, but the faint scar was there, and there was a shadow on her cheekbone that spoke of an old blow. He knew those marks. He had seen them on men in the army who were bullied by their sergeants. He had seen them on horses that had been broken with a heavy hand. He looked her in the eye. Clara flinched, pulling her sleeves down quickly to hide the marks. She waited for him to ask. She waited for the judgment. "Who hit you? Why did you let them? What kind of woman gets treated so?" Elias said nothing. He merely poked the fire, sending sparks rushing up the chimney. "Eat," he said, nodding toward the porridge. "You need strength." The restraint was heavy in the room. It was not indifference. Clara realized with a jolt that it was kindness. He was giving her the dignity of her silence. She sat up slowly, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. She looked toward the window. Through the glass, she could see the world outside. The snow was piled 4 feet high. The mountains were endless, white peaks stretching into the distance. It was beautiful, but it was a prison. She was miles from civilization. She was snowed in with a man she did not know, a man who slept with a rifle. She had traded the danger of the town for the danger of isolation. Elias stood up suddenly, his head cocked to the side. "What is it?" Clara asked, clutching the baby tighter. Elias moved to the door. He pressed his ear against the wood. Clara strained her hearing. At first, she heard nothing. Then, faint and distorted by the distance and the echoes of the valley, she heard it, voices, or maybe the crack of a rifle shot. It was far down the mountain, perhaps miles away, carried on the thin, cold air, but it was there. Elias turned back to her. His face was grim. "They are looking," he said flatly. He checked the load in his rifle. The metallic clicked loud in the quiet room. Clara felt the cold seep back into her bones. The town had not given up. They were searching, and the smoke from the chimney, the smoke that had saved her life, was now a beacon marking their location. The cabin would not stay hidden forever. The days following the birth did not pass in hours, but in drifts of snow and intervals of pain. Clara Hale lay in the bed that Elias Mercer had surrendered to her, a bed that smelled of cedar shavings and a man's solitary life. Her body felt as though it had been unmade and stitched back together by a blind seamstress. She was weak, a weakness that went down to the marrow of her bones, leaving her trembling even when the fire roared in the stone hearth. Elias moved through the cabin like a ghost, haunting his own home. He was a large man, yet he learned quickly how to make himself small, how to step softly on the timber floorboards so as not to wake the infant sleeping in a crate lined with rabbit fur. He cooked. That was his primary language of care. He made broths from dried venison and wild onions, dark and salty, and brought them to her in a tin cup. He did not ask if she was hungry. He simply held the cup out until she took it. "Drink," he would say. "It will put iron back in your blood." One evening, 3 days after the child arrived, Clara woke to the sensation of heat against her feet. Elias was kneeling at the foot of the bed, sliding smooth river stones, wrapped in flannel, under the heavy wool blankets. He had warmed them by the fire. "You are shivering," he said, not looking at her face. Clara watched him. His movements were efficient, almost military, but there was a hesitation in them now, a caution that had not been there when he held the rifle. "You are kind to do this," Clara said. Her voice was still a rasp, thin as paper. Elias stood up abruptly, dusting his hands on his trousers. "I am doing what needs doing. I do not know women's business. I know how to keep livestock alive in a freeze. It is not so different." It was a rough thing to say, but Clara saw the way his eyes darted to the baby, who let out a soft, mewling grunt. Elias flinched, his shoulders tightening. He looked at the infant with a mixture of terror and awe, as if the baby were a stick of dynamite that might go off at any moment. He picked the boy up later that night when Clara's arms were too heavy to lift him. Elias held the baby away from his body at first, stiff-armed, before slowly, awkwardly, bringing him into the crook of his elbow. His large hand, scarred and calloused from chopping wood and skinning game, dwarfed the child's head. "He is small," Elias murmured. "He does not weigh more than a rifle. He is strong," Clara said softly from the bed. "Like you." Elias looked at her then, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "I am not strong, Mrs. Hale. I am just stubborn. There is a difference." They circled each other like strange dogs for the first week. The storm had locked them in a white cage. The snow piled halfway up the window panes. It forced a terrifying intimacy upon them. There were no rooms to retreat to, no doors to close other than the one that led to the deathly cold outside. When Elias needed to wash or change his shirt, he would turn his back to the room, facing the corner, his spine rigid. When Clara needed to nurse the child or tend to her own broken body, Elias would suddenly find a task that required his intense attention at the wood stove, staring fixedly into the flames until she told him it was safe to turn around. It was during one of these long, firelit evenings that the silence finally broke. "Where is this place?" Clara asked. She was sitting up, the baby asleep at her breast. "You are in the high country," Elias answered. He was cleaning his revolver. A slow, rhythmic motion of cloth against steel, north of the mining claims, south of nowhere. "Is there a town? Silver Creek is 3 days' ride south, but you came from there, didn't you?" Clara stiffened. "I did. And you are not keen to go back?" "No." Elias set the gun down on the table. The metal made a heavy thud. "I need to know," he said. "I am not asking for your life story, Clara, but if the law is coming up that mountain, I need to know why. A man does not drag a pregnant woman through a blizzard for a petty theft." Clara looked down at her son's sleeping face. She traced the curve of his ear with her finger. "My husband was named Samuel," she began. Her voice was steady, though her hands were not. "He died 2 weeks ago. He was found at the bottom of a ravine near the Blackwood mine." "An accident?" Elias asked. "That is what the foreman said. Samuel was drunk more often than he was sober. The path is narrow. It was an easy thing to believe, but the town did not want to believe it." Clara said. She looked up, her eyes hard and dry. "Samuel and I argued the night before. Everyone heard it. The walls in Miners' Row are thin as paper. I told him I would leave him if he spent another $1 on whiskey. I told him he was rot." She took a breath. "He died, and I did not cry. Elias, that was my crime. I stood at the grave and I felt nothing but relief that the shouting was over. The women saw it. They said I was too proud. They said a widow who does not weep is a widow with a guilty conscience. Then the sheriff found a button from Samuel's coat in our shack, torn off. He said it proved a struggle. He said I pushed him." Elias watched her. He did not offer sympathy. He weighed her words like he weighed gold dust, looking for the glint of truth. "Widows without family are easy to punish." Clara added bitterly, "I am not from here. I have no brothers to stand on the porch with shotguns. I was just a woman with a dead husband and a baby coming, and they decided I was a witch who murdered him for a share of a mine that yields nothing but dust." Elias nodded slowly. He picked up the revolver again, spinning the cylinder. "A town needs a story," he said quietly. "It keeps them from looking at their own sins." "And why are you here?" Clara asked, emboldened by his acceptance. "You are not a trapper. You live like a soldier who is still at war." Elias stopped his hands. He looked at the scar that ran down his face, a jagged white line that disappeared into his beard. "I was a hired hand. Once," he said, "down in Wyoming, a range war started. Rich men drawing lines on maps they had never seen. I worked for a man who thought buying a gun gave him the right to use it on anyone who crossed his fence. I testified against him when he burned out a squatter family." He stood up and walked to the window, staring at the black reflection of the room in the glass. "He had friends, powerful friends. They said I was the one who lit the fire. They said I was a mad dog. I spent a year in a territorial prison before a judge overturned it, but the name stuck. Dangerous, unstable." He turned back to her. "I came up here because the mountains do not care what your name is. They only care if you can cut wood and shoot straight, but you should know. Clara, you are in disputed country. There is no law here. The map says it is territory land. The miners say it is theirs, and the tribes say it belongs to the spirits. If the sheriff comes here, he brings his own law." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft. "We are trapped," she whispered. Elias looked at the snow pressed against the glass. "Winter is the only jailer I trust," he said. "It will keep them out for now, but it keeps us in, too." The day settled into a rhythm of survival. Survival, Clara learned, was a series of small, unending tasks. As her strength returned, she refused to stay in the bed. She sat by the fire mending Elias's shirts, her needle flashing in the orange light. She took over the cooking, turning his simple provisions into meals that tasted of something other than salt and iron. Elias spent the daylight hours battling the elements. He chopped wood until his breath hung in clouds around his head, building a stack against the cabin wall that grew higher every day. He hauled water from the creek, breaking the ice with a sledgehammer, carrying 2 heavy buckets up the slope with a yoke across his shoulders. Subtle intimacy grew in the spaces between these chores. It was not spoken. It was in the way Elias would pause at the door to stomp the snow off his boots, waiting until Clara nodded before entering, ensuring he did not startle the baby. It was in the way Clara learned how he took his coffee, black, boiling hot, and had it ready for him when he came in from the cold. One afternoon, the baby was fussy, colicky and crying with a thin, reedy sound that grated on the nerves. Clara walked him back and forth, exhausted, her back aching. "Give him here," Elias said. He did not wait for permission. He took the bundle from her arms. He sat in the rocking chair, the wood creaking under his weight. He laid the baby across his forearm, stomach down, and began to pat his back with a rhythmic, heavy hand. The crying stopped. The baby let out a long sigh and gripped Elias's index finger with a tiny hand. Elias froze. He looked down at the small, pink fingers curled around his callous, dirt-stained skin. His face softened, the hard lines around his mouth relaxing in a way Clara had not seen before. He looked younger, less like a monument to endurance and more like a man. "He has a grip," Elias noted softly. Clara watched him from the table, a strange ache blooming in her chest. It was dangerous. She knew. To feel safe. Safety was a lie. But watching this scarred, solitary man rock her son, she felt the tight knot of fear in her stomach loosen just a fraction. Trust was taking root in the frozen soil of their situation, growing faster than she would have thought possible. That night, after the baby was asleep, Clara stood by the hearth. She was still pale, her hair in a loose braid over her shoulder. She looked at Elias, who was oiling his boots by the door. "Elias," she said. He looked up. "Yeah? Thank you." She said. The words felt inadequate. "You could have left me on the doorstep. You could have turned me out once the storm broke." Elias looked at her. The firelight caught the gold in her eyes and the flush of heat on her cheeks. She was wearing one of his old flannel shirts over her dress because it was cold, and the sight of her in his clothes did something to his chest that he did not like. It made him want things he had sworn off years ago. He looked at her too long. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. He saw the pulse jumping in her throat. He saw the way she leaned slightly toward him, perhaps without even knowing it. Desire collided with fear. He wanted to cross the room. He wanted to touch her face, just to see if her skin was as soft as it looked. But he remembered the bruises on her wrists. He remembered the dead husband in the ravine. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loud against the floor. "I need to check the horses," he said roughly. He went out into the cold, leaving her standing alone by the fire, her heart hammering against her ribs. The next day, Clara felt a heaviness in her spirit that matched the gray sky. She sat on the edge of the bed, the baby nursing fitfully. "I feel dirty," she said suddenly into the quiet of the room. Elias was sharpening his axe. The rhythmic shh of the stone against the blade stopped. "Why?" he asked. "The way they looked at me in town," Clara said, staring at the wall. "Even before Samuel died, they looked at me like I was something spoiled, and now I am a widow, hiding in a mountain man's cabin. I know what they would call me. They think a woman without a husband is just a body waiting to sin." She pulled the blanket up, covering her shoulder. "I feel like I have done something wrong just by surviving." Elias set the axe down. He walked over to her, his boots heavy on the wood. He did not sit, but he stood close enough that she could smell the pine resin on his clothes. "Clara," he said. His voice was unexpectedly gentle, a low rumble. "A town's judgment is not the truth. It is just noise. The wind makes noise, too, but it does not mean anything. You brought a life into this world in the middle of a blizzard. There is nothing dirty about that. That is the cleanest thing there is." Clara looked up at him, tears pricking her eyes. He hesitated, then spoke again. "There is something we should do. For the afterbirth, I put it in a bucket, kept it frozen in the shed. It is an old way, something I learned from the tribes and the old settlers. You bury it. You give it back to the land. It marks the child's place." Clara nodded, wiping her eyes. "Yes, I would like that." They went out behind the cabin, to a spot where two great pines crossed their branches. The snow was deep, but Elias had cleared a patch of earth. He dug a small hole with a spade, the ground frozen and resisting. Elias brought the vessel out and placed the contents into the earth with a solemn reverence. He did not treat it as refuse. He treated it as part of the mystery of life. He covered it with soil, then dragged 3 large, flat stones to mark the spot. "This is his ground now," Elias said. "He has a stake here." Clara stood in the biting wind, wrapped in a blanket, and wept. She did not cry for Samuel. She did not cry for the life she had lost. She cried because for the first time in years, she was being treated with respect, not as a possession, not as a problem, but as a human being. Elias stood beside her, his body blocking the wind. He did not touch her, but his presence was a wall between her and the cold. "We need a plan," Elias said later that evening. He spread a tattered map out on the table. "I cannot stay here," Clara said. "I know that." "I am putting you in danger." Elias traced a line on the map with his finger. "Once the pass clears, maybe in 2 weeks, we can ride, not south to Silver Creek. West, toward the Snake River. There is a settlement there. Crossing, it is bigger. There is a federal judge who rides the circuit." "A judge?" "If we can get to a judge, a real one, not bought by a mining company. You can tell your story. Get it written down." Clara looked at the map. It was a tangled web of ridges and rivers. "Will we make it?" she asked. Elias looked at her. "I will get you there. Clara, I swear it." He was reluctant to leave the mountain. This cabin was his shield, but he knew the shield was cracking. The smoke, the tracks, the rumors, they would find them. A few nights later, Clara woke with a fire in her blood. Her breasts were hard and painful, and her head swam with fever. Infection, or just exhaustion, had finally caught her. She moaned, tossing on the bed. Elias was there instantly. He placed a hand on her forehead. His palm was rough, but cool. "You are burning," he said. He sat with her through the night. He bathed her face with cool water. He held the baby when he cried, pacing the floor so Clara could rest. At the darkest hour, just before dawn, Clara reached out. Her hand found his where it rested on his knee. "Elias," she whispered. He froze. He looked down at her hand, pale and small against his dark trousers. He could have pulled away. He should have, but he did not. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. "I am here," he said. They held hands in the darkness, the contact simple yet terrifyingly intense. It was an anchor in the storm. For that hour, they were not a widow and a recluse. They were just two people keeping the dark at bay. They pretended it was only comfort, but the air between them hummed with something else. The next morning, the fever broke. But a new crisis emerged. Clara's milk was failing. The stress and the fever had taken their toll. The baby cried, a hungry, hollow sound that tore at Clara's heart. She tried to nurse, but there was little there. "He is starving," she said, panic rising in her voice. Elias checked the pantry. They had venison, flour, coffee, no milk, no sugar. "I have to go," he said. "Go where?" "There is a trading post at the junction." 20 miles east. That is too far," Clara said. "The drifts are deep, and if someone sees you, I can trade for goat's milk, canned milk, something." Elias was already buckling on his gun belt. He pulled on his heavy buffalo coat. "Do not go," Clara pleaded. She was terrified, not of the hunger, but of being alone, of him not coming back. "I have to," Elias said. He looked at the baby. He will not last 2 days without food. He rode out on his roan gelding, leading the pack horse. Clara watched him disappear into the trees, feeling a silence descend on the cabin that was heavier than lead. She waited. 1 day passed. Then a night. She paced the floor, rocking the crying baby, feeding him spoonfuls of water mixed with flour, which he spat out. "He is dead," she thought. "They caught him, or the wolves got him." Late on the second day, a shape emerged from the tree line. Clara threw open the door, forgetting the cold. Elias rode into the clearing. He was slumped in the saddle. The pack horse was laden with sacks. He slid off the horse and nearly fell. Clara ran to him. His face was scraped raw on one side, bleeding sluggishly. His coat was torn. The horse was blowing hard, white foam on its neck. "You are hurt," Clara cried. "I ran into a scree slide." Elias grunted. Horse lost footing. "We slid 50 feet. He began to untie the sacks. He pulled out tins of condensed milk, a bag of sugar, and soft flannel. "I got it," he said. Clara looked at the supplies, then at his bleeding face. A sudden, white-hot anger surged through her. She shoved him. "You could have died," she screamed. The sound echoed off the cabin walls. "You stupid man! You could have died and left us here." Elias stared at her, stunned. "I did it for the boy." He said. "I do not care about the milk," Clara shouted, tears streaming down her face. "I care about you. Do not you understand? I cannot bear it if you do not come back." The confession hung in the air, sharp as icicles. Clara clamped her hand over her mouth, realizing what she had admitted. That fear frightened her more than the storm, more than the sheriff. She needed him, not just for survival, but for him. Elias looked at her. The exhaustion seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a slow, dawning realization. He stepped closer. He reached out and touched her shoulder. "I came back," he said softly. "I will always come back." The days that followed were different. The line between them had blurred. "You need to learn to shoot," Elias said one morning. He did not say it as a threat, but as a fact. He took her outside, behind the cabin where the wind was blocked. He handed her his heavy Colt revolver. "It is too heavy," Clara said, feeling the weight of it drag her arm down. "Use 2 hands," Elias commanded. He stood behind her. He moved close, his chest almost touching her back. He reached around, his arms encircling hers, guiding her hands. "Stand like this," he said, feet apart. She could feel the heat radiating from him. She could smell the gun oil, the wood smoke, and the scent of the man himself. Her heart hammered against her ribs, loud in the quiet morning. "Focus on the sight," Elias murmured. His breath ghosted against her ear, warm and intimate. "Squeeze. Do not pull." Clara tried to focus on the tree stump 50 yards away, but all she could focus on was the feeling of his hand steadying hers. The lesson was about survival, but the language was touch. "Steady," he whispered. She pulled the trigger. The gun roared, kicking back. The bullet struck the snow to the left of the stump. "Again," Elias said. He did not move away. They spent an hour there, firing until the cylinder was empty, reloading, firing again. By the end, Clara could hit the stump. Her hands were numb from the cold, but her blood was singing. "Let us go inside," Elias said finally. He walked toward the creek to break the ice for fresh water, telling her to warm up. Clara turned to the door, wiping the soot from her hands. "Elias!" His voice was a sharp bark. Clara spun around. Elias was standing by the creek bank, looking down. He was not breaking the ice. He was staring at the snow. Clara ran to him, her skirts dragging in the powder. "What is it?" she asked. Elias pointed. There, in the soft snow near the water's edge, were tracks, hoof prints, not the unshod hooves of wild mustangs, but the distinct, heavy prints of shod horses. There were many of them. They circled the clearing, stopping just inside the tree line, then turning back down the valley. "They were here," Elias said grimly, "while we were shooting." "Fresh?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Elias touched the edge of a print. The snow was still crumbling into it. "Within the hour," he said. He looked up at the ridge, his eyes scanning the trees. The sanctuary was breached. The town's reach had finally climbed the mountain. "Go inside," Elias said, his hand dropping to his gun. "Pack the bags. We leave at first light." The snow had stopped falling, but the wind had not surrendered. It scoured the high ridges of the Bitterroot Range, stripping the powder from the rock and sending it swirling into the valleys like white smoke. Elias Mercer lay on his stomach on a granite outcropping, wrapped in a buffalo robe that blended with the gray stone. He lowered his brass telescope, his fingers stiff inside his gloves. Below him, 1,000 feet down the slope, 3 riders picked their way through the timber. They were not moving with the casual drift of men looking for lost cattle. They were riding in a grid, methodically sweeping the draws. Elias watched them for a long time. He knew the horses. They were big, grain-fed bays, branded on the hip with a lazy H, the Hale brand. And he knew the men, or at least he knew their type. They wore heavy dusters and rode with rifles scabbarded under their legs, ready to draw. They were not searching. They were hunting. Elias slid backward until he was below the skyline, then stood and made his way back to where his own horse was tied in a thicket of aspen. He rode the 2 miles back to the cabin, his mind working like a clock mechanism, ticking through the grim calculations of ammunition, food, and time. When he entered the cabin, Clara was standing by the stove, the baby tied to her chest in a sling made from a blanket. She looked at his face and knew. "They are Hales," Elias said, hanging his hat on the peg. "3 of them. They are sweeping the lower creek. They will be here by tomorrow if they keep that line." Clara sank onto the wooden bench. Her face was pale, the skin stretched tight over her cheekbones. "They will not stop," she said quietly. "Caleb Hale will not stop until he sees me dead or in a cell." Elias poured himself a cup of coffee, the metal pot clattering against the rim. "Why?" he asked. He turned to face her. "It is more than a dead brother. Clara, men do not ride through high country winter just for grief. Grief usually stays by the fire with a bottle. This feels like hate." Clara looked down at the sleeping infant. "It is hate," she said, "but it is not new. They hated me from the day Samuel brought me to Silver Creek." She looked up, her eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp defiance. "I was not one of them. Elias, I came from the east, from the tenements. I have no family name. I have no land. When Samuel married me, his father said he was bringing a stray dog into the house. They thought I was after their money, though God knows Samuel never saw a dime of it." She paused, taking a breath that hitched in her chest. "And I refused them. That is the real sin. Caleb, Samuel's older brother. He came to the shack when Samuel was away at the mine. He offered to help me with bills. He said a woman like me must be lonely. He put his hands on me." Elias went very still. His eyes narrowed. "I told him I would cut his throat if he touched me again," Clara said, her voice trembling with the memory of that fear. "He laughed at me. He called me trash. He said I should be grateful a Hale would even look at me. When Samuel died, Caleb saw his chance. If I am a murderer, then I am gone. And if I am gone, no one remembers that I rejected him." Elias set the cup down. The ceramic clicked against the wood table. "It is pride," he said softly. "Rich men kill for pride faster than poor men kill for bread." He walked over to the window, staring at the white expanse that separated them from the world. "I know how that song goes," he said. Clara watched his back. "You?" Elias nodded. "I was not always a ghost on a mountain. 10 years ago, I was working a herd near Laramie. The foreman was a man named Stokes. He liked to use his whip on things, horses, dogs, men who were slower than he liked. I saw him beat a stable boy near to death for losing a bridle. He turned, and the scar on his face seemed to darken in the dim light. I broke his jaw. I dragged him to the sheriff and testified. I thought the law was the law, but Stokes was the ranch owner's nephew. The sheriff arrested me for assault. The town, they did not want to believe a foreman was a savage. It was easier to believe the drifter was dangerous. They beat me in that cell. Clara, they beat me until I could not see out of my left eye. And when they let me out, they told me to run, so I ran." He looked at her, and the distance between them collapsed. They were 2 people marked by the same iron. "They make us into monsters so they do not have to look at themselves," Elias said. "We cannot stay here," Clara whispered. "No," Elias agreed. "We cannot." They spent the afternoon moving the essentials. Elias had built a lean-to cache 3 years ago, hidden in a deep fissure of rock half a mile up the ridge. It was cold, barely more than a cave with a timber roof, but it was invisible from the valley floor. The work was brutal. The air was thin at this altitude, and every breath burned. Clara carried the baby, wrapped in 3 layers of wool, while Elias hauled sacks of flour and dried meat. The snow was crusted with ice, breaking under their boots with every step, threatening to twist an ankle or send them sliding down the shale. By late afternoon, the cache was stocked. They returned to the cabin for one last load of bedding. Elias was by the door, reaching for his rifle, when he froze. A horse blew air, loud and wet. It was close. Elias shoved Clara back. "Hide!" he hissed. There was no time to run to the woods. Elias pointed to the corner of the room where the floorboards were loose. He had dug a small root cellar there for keeping potatoes from freezing. "Get in! Do not make a sound!" Clara scrambled. She pulled the heavy iron stove slightly to the side, adrenaline giving her strength she did not possess, and pried up the boards. It was dark and smelled of earth and old onions. She slid down, clutching the baby tight against her shoulder, praying he would not cry. Elias dropped the boards back in place and kicked a rug over the seam. He threw a pile of cured wolf pelts on top of it. Then he opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, his rifle cradled in his arms. A rider was sitting his horse not 10 yards away. He was a big man with a red beard and a coat made of buffalo hide. He had a badge pinned to his vest, but it looked dull, as if it had not been polished in years. "Afternoon," the rider said. He did not smile. "Afternoon," Elias replied. His voice was flat, devoid of fear or welcome. "You are Mercer," the rider stated. "I am." The rider leaned forward, resting his hands on his saddle horn. "I am Deputy Carson. We are looking for a woman, a widow. Name of Clara Hale. I have no neighbors," Elias said. "You can see that for yourself." Carson spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. It left a brown stain. "We heard you bought milk at the junction. A single man does not have much use for milk. Mercer, unless he has got a cat, or a guest. I have a stomach ulcer." Elias lied smoothly. "Doctor told me to drink it." Carson laughed. It was a dry, barking sound. "You have got a reputation. Mercer, folks say you are crazy. Folks say you are dangerous. I say you are just a man who likes to hide." He walked his horse a few steps closer. The animal's hooves crunched on the packed snow. "That woman is a killer. Mercer," she bashed her husband's head in with a rock. "She is carrying a bastard child, likely not even his. The Hales want her back. They want justice." Elias did not blink. His finger rested lightly on the trigger guard of his Winchester. "If she killed a man, the law will find her," Elias said. "But she is not here." Carson studied him. He looked at the cabin, at the smoke curling from the chimney. He looked at the wood pile. "If I find out you are lying, Mercer, I will burn this shack to the ground with you in it. Aiding a fugitive is a hanging offense in this territory." "Get off my land," Elias said. Carson sneered. He wheeled his horse around. "We will be back," he called over his shoulder. "And next time, we won't be asking politely." He kicked his horse into a trot and disappeared into the trees. Elias stood on the porch for 5 long minutes, watching the tree line, making sure the man was truly gone. Then he turned and rushed back inside. He threw the pelts aside and ripped up the floorboards. "Clara?" She reached up, her hand trembling. Elias grabbed her wrist and hauled her out. She was covered in dust, her eyes wide with terror. The baby was awake, his mouth open in a silent cry that finally broke into a wail as the fresh air hit him. Clara collapsed against the table, her legs giving out. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. "He called me a whore," she whispered. "I heard him. He said I killed Samuel with a rock." Elias slammed the door and bolted it. He crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed Clara by the shoulders. His restraint, the iron control he had maintained for weeks, shattered. "Look at me," he commanded. His voice was rough, almost a shout. Clara looked up, startled by his intensity. "He is a liar," Elias said fiercely. "He is a bought dog barking for his master. I do not care what he said. I care that you are breathing." He was gripping her hard, his fingers digging into the wool of her dress. He was terrifying in his anger, and yet Clara felt safer in that grip than she had ever felt in her life. "I wanted to kill him," Elias confessed, his voice dropping to a growl. "When he spoke your name, I wanted to put a bullet in his chest." He let her go abruptly and turned away, running a hand through his hair. He was shaking too. Clara stared at his back. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he leaned against the wall as if he were holding it up. "Elias," she said softly. He did not turn. "I have never felt safe," she said. The words came out unbidden. "Not with my father. He hit us when the crop failed. Not with Samuel. He hit me when the whiskey ran out. I thought men were just things that hurt you." She took a step toward him. "But when you stood on that porch, when you lied for me..." Elias turned slowly. His eyes were dark, filled with a storm of their own. "I have never let anyone in. Clara, not since the war, not since the prison. I thought if I let someone close, I would just lose them, or I would fail them. He looked at her, really looked at her, stripping away the layers of circumstance and fear. I am failing you now, he said. They found us. No, Clara said. She reached out and took his hand. His skin was rough, calloused, but warm. You are the only reason I am alive. The air in the cabin shifted. The fear of the rider, the cold of the storm, the threat of the law. It all seemed to recede, leaving only the two of them in the small, firelit space. The baby had settled, lulled by the warmth. Clara looked up at him. She saw the man beneath the scars. She saw the loneliness that matched her own, a deep, aching hollow that they had both been trying to fill with silence. Elias looked down at her. He saw the bruise on her soul, and he saw the steel spine that held her upright. He stepped closer. It was not a conscious decision. It was a magnetic pull, inevitable as gravity. Clara, he breathed. He cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed her cheekbones, erasing the memory of the dust, erasing the tears. Clara leaned into his touch. She closed her eyes and tilted her head up. He kissed her. It was not a smooth kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of coffee and fear and a longing so sharp it felt like a wound. It was the collision of two people who had been starving for kindness. Elias's arms went around her, pulling her against him, hard, as if he could merge their broken pieces into something whole. Clara gripped his shirt, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to him. For a moment, the world existed only in the pressure of his mouth on hers, in the heat of his body, in the frantic, terrified beat of their hearts. Then, from the crate near the stove, the baby let out a sharp cry. They broke apart as if they had been burned. Clara stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. Her lips felt swollen, tingling. Elias looked at her, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and dark. Clara stammered. I am sorry. I should not have. Elias shook his head. Do not, he said hoarsely. Do not apologize. He walked over to the crate and looked down at the baby, trying to steady his breathing. Clara sank into the chair. Guilt washed over her, cold and heavy. Samuel was dead only 2 weeks. She was a widow. She was a mother. She was running for her life. What right did she have to this? What right did she have to steal warmth from this man? It is wrong, she whispered. I am bringing you nothing but ruin. I am stealing your life, Elias, and I am disrespecting the dead. Elias turned on her. His face was hard again, but not with anger at her. The dead are dead. Clara. He spoke with the authority of a man who had seen battlefields. I have buried more men than I can count. Good men, bad men. They do not get to own the living. Samuel is gone. You are here. You are fighting for that boy. There is no sin in wanting to not be alone while you do it. He crouched in front of her. But we cannot stay here. Carson was right about one thing. They will burn us out. What do we do? Clara asked, wiping her eyes. We stop running, Elias said. Running just makes us prey. We need to hunt back. How? We need a judge, a real one. Not the drunk in Silver Creek, but we cannot get to the circuit court. You said the pass is blocked. Elias nodded. But there are other ways. I know a man, a trader. Name of Silas Blue. He moves between the territories. He knows everyone. He knows which judges are honest and which ones are bought by the mining companies. Where is he? He camps at the hot springs, a day's ride north. We leave at dawn. They did not sleep that night. They packed. They cleaned the cabin, leaving it as spotless as Elias had kept it for 7 years. It was a ritual of goodbye. Elias greased the hinges of the door. He swept the hearth. He was saying farewell to his sanctuary. At first light, the sky was a bruised purple. The air was so cold it froze the hairs inside their noses. Elias saddled the horses, his movements quick and efficient. He helped Clara mount the roan, handing her the baby bundle. She looked down at him. Are you ready? He asked. Clara looked at the cabin one last time. It looked small against the towering pines. It had been a place of pain, but it had also been the place where she was reborn. Yes, she said. They rode north. The snow was deep, reaching the horses' bellies in places. Elias rode point, breaking the trail, his rifle across his saddle. By noon, they reached the hot springs. Steam rose from the ground, creating a ghostly fog among the trees. A canvas tent was pitched near the water, and a mule was tethered to a stump. A man stepped out of the steam. He was short, with skin the color of old leather and hair braided with beads. He wore a coat made of Hudson's Bay blankets. Silas Blue raised a hand. "Mercer," he called out. His voice was like cracking branches. "I smelled trouble on the wind. Figured it was you." Elias dismounted. "Silas," he said, "I need help." Silas looked at Clara, then at the baby. He spat into the snow. "You've got a full wagon of it. Looks like—" They sat by Silas's fire, drinking tea made from pine needles and bitter root. Elias told the story. He held nothing back. He told him about the birth, the accusations, the hails. Silas listened, his black eyes darting between them. When Elias finished, Silas sat silent for a long time. "You think this is about a woman scorned?" Silas asked, looking at Clara. "You think Caleb Hale chases you because you said no?" Clara nodded. "He is a proud man." "He is a greedy man," Silas corrected. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a tattered ledger. He flipped through the pages. "I trade news as much as furs." Silas said, "I was in Silver Creek 3 days ago. The Hales are buying up claims, but there is one claim they cannot buy because the owner is dead. The Silver Queen. That was Samuel's." Clara said, "It is worthless. A dry hole." Silas shook his head. "That is what they told the town. But word is, the assayer found a vein of silver as thick as your arm the week before Samuel died." Clara gasped. "Samuel did not know?" Elias asked. "Maybe he found out," Silas said darkly. "Maybe that is why he ended up in a ravine. But here's the law. Mercer, if a man dies without a will, his property goes to his widow and his child." Clara stared at the fire. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They did not just hate her. They were robbing her. They were trying to hang her so they could steal her son's inheritance. "They want the mine," she whispered. "They want the deed," Silas said. "And as long as you are alive, Mrs. Hale, and as long as that baby is breathing, they cannot touch it, unless you are a convicted murderer. Then the property is forfeit to the state, and the Hales can buy it for pennies at auction." Elias stood up. His face was terrible to look at. "It is not just prejudice," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "It is business." He looked at Clara. "We are not going to run to the Snake River," he said. "We are going to find that assayer, and then we are going to find a judge." Silas stood up too. "The circuit judge is in Majestic City. 2 days hard ride, but you will have to cross the valley floor. That is open ground." "We will cross it," Elias said. He turned to Clara. He reached out and adjusted the blanket around the baby, his hand lingering for a second on her arm. "We are going to get what is yours. Clara." The part ended with them riding away from the springs, the steam fading behind them. The mountains towered over them, jagged and white. They were no longer just surviving. They were at war. And as they descended toward the valley, the sun broke over the peaks, casting long, sharp shadows that looked like knives waiting in the snow. The descent from the high country was a slow, grinding war against the land. The mountains, which had been their fortress, seemed reluctant to let them go, throwing up barriers of scree and ice-choked ravines that forced them to double back time and again. The wind did not cease. It drove grit into their eyes and numbed their exposed skin until Clara felt as though her face were a mask carved from wood. They reached the Snake River 3 days after leaving the hot springs. The water was gray and swollen, churning with chunks of ice that clashed together with the sound of grinding teeth. There was no bridge here, only a ford that Elias knew from his days driving cattle, a shallow bar of gravel that shifted with the current. "We have to cross," Elias shouted over the roar of the water. He sat his horse, looking at the far bank, his eyes narrowed against the spray. Clara clutched the baby against her chest inside her coat. The boy was crying, a thin, exhausted wail that had been going on for hours. She was terrified. She looked at the black water and saw only death. "It is too deep," she yelled back. "It will be deeper tomorrow." Elias answered, "The melt is starting up high. We go now." He tied a lead rope from his saddle to the bridle of Clara's roan. "Keep your knees tight," he commanded. "Do not look down at the water. Look at the trees on the other side. If you look at the water, you will get dizzy and you will fall." They plunged in. The cold was a physical shock, a hammer blow that made the horses gasp and scramble. The water rose to the stirrups, then to Clara's ankles, soaking her boots and the hem of her dress instantly. The current grabbed at the legs of the horses, pushing them downstream. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, praying in a whisper. She felt the roan stumble, slipping on a sleek rock. The horse lurched, dipping its shoulder. Icy water rushed over Clara's thigh. The baby screamed louder. "Hold him up!" Elias roared. Clara hauled on the reins, finding balance where there should have been none, driven by the singular, ferocious need to keep her son dry. The roan found its footing, snorting in panic, and lunged forward. Elias's horse, a massive bay with quarters like boulders, hauled them through the worst of the channel, muscles straining under the wet coat. They scrambled up the far bank, mud flying, and collapsed onto the frozen grass. Clara was shaking so hard she could barely uncurl her fingers from the reins. Elias was off his horse in a second, pulling her down, checking the baby. "Is he dry?" Elias demanded. Clara nodded, her teeth chattering. "He is dry, but I am freezing." Elias did not offer false comfort. He built a fire quickly, using dry driftwood he had gathered before the crossing, shielding the flame with his body until it caught. He set up a windbreak with the saddle blankets. "We cannot stop for long," he said, feeding the fire. "But we will dry out." He rationed their food with a miser's hand, a strip of dried beef and a handful of hardtack for him, the last of the condensed milk and the softer bread for her. He ate standing up, watching their back trail. His eyes never resting, he avoided the open trails, guiding them through thickets of willow and alder where the branches whipped their faces but hid their passage from any patrols that might be quartering the valley. 2 days later, they rode into Oak Haven. It was not a city, but it was the largest settlement Clara had seen in a year. It was a scar of civilization cut into the valley floor, 2 rows of false-fronted buildings, a livery stable, a church with a peeling white steeple, and the smell of coal smoke and horse manure hanging heavy in the damp air. As they rode down the main street, the mud sucking at the horses' hooves, Clara felt the change in the atmosphere. In the mountains, she was a survivor. Here, she was a spectacle. Women walking along the boardwalk paused to watch them pass. They saw a woman with wind-burned skin and wild hair, riding astride like a man, carrying a child, accompanied by a scarred brute of a man who looked like he had crawled out of a wolf den. They whispered behind their hands. Their eyes were sharp, judging, stripping Clara of her dignity. "Look at her," a woman in a bonnet murmured loud enough to be heard, "running with a savage. And a baby too. Shameful." Clara kept her head high, but her face burned. She felt the old shame rising, the feeling of being dirty that she had confessed to Elias in the cabin. She wanted to shrink, to hide, but she remembered the 3 stones over the afterbirth and the way Elias had looked at her. "Ignore them," Elias said low. His voice was a growl. "They are just sheep bleating at a wolf." They stopped at the general store. Elias dismounted and tied the horses. He helped Clara down, his hands lingering on her waist for a fraction of a second too long, a protective gesture that drew a glare from a man sweeping the boardwalk. "Stay close," Elias said. They walked inside. The store was warm, smelling of coffee beans and dry goods. The shopkeeper, a balding man with an apron, looked up with a smile that vanished the moment he saw Elias. "We are closed," the man said flatly. "The door is open." Elias replied, "We need grain for the horses, and fresh milk." "I said we are closed," the shopkeeper repeated. "I know who you are. You are Mercer, the one who burned that barn down Wyoming way. I do not serve firebugs, and I do not serve." He looked at Clara, his eyes raking over her disheveled dress and the baby. I do not serve trailing women, he finished. Elias went still. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He took a step forward, his hand drifting toward the revolver at his hip. Elias, Clara said sharply. She put a hand on his arm. Elias stopped. He looked at the shopkeeper, his eyes cold and dead. Your loss? Elias said. He turned and walked out, shepherding Clara before him. Outside, a young deputy was leaning against a hitching post, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. Move along, Mercer, the deputy said. We do not want trouble here. Keep riding. We are seeing the doctor, Elias said. Is that against the law? Depends on what you need a doctor for. The deputy smirked. Maybe to check for lice? Elias's jaw tightened until the muscle jumped. He did not speak. He untied the horses and led them down the street to a small house with a shingle that read, A. Thorne, physician. They are trying to make you angry, Clara said quietly as they walked. They want you to draw that gun so they can kill you and call it justice. I know, Elias said. His voice was tight. It is a cage. Clara, reputations are cages. Once you are inside, they lock the door and throw away the key. Doctor. Thorne was a man of 60 with hands that shook slightly until they touched a patient, at which point they became steady as stone. He looked at Elias with suspicion, but he looked at the baby with concern, and that was enough. He examined Clara in the back room while Elias waited in the parlor, pacing the small rug like a caged tiger. The doctor asked Clara to lower her dress to check her ribs. He saw the old, yellowing bruises, the way the bones had knitted slightly crooked. He saw the scars on her back. These are not from a fall, the doctor said quietly. He was dipping a pen into an inkwell. No, Clara said. She stared at the wall. My husband, and the wrist, he twisted it. The doctor wrote in a heavy, leather-bound ledger. He did not ask for details of the drama. He recorded the facts. Patient presence with multiple healed fractures consistent with long-term physical trauma. Marks indicative of defensive wounds. General malnutrition. This book, Clara asked, pulling her dress back up. Will it stand in a court? The doctor looked at her over his spectacles. It is a medical record, madam. It is the truth of the body. The body does not lie, even when the lawyers do. He handed her a slip of paper with a summary of his findings. Keep this, he said, and feed that baby. He is strong, but he needs fat. When they left the doctor's office, the sun was setting. The street was emptying, but the eyes were still there, watching from behind curtains. We need a place to sleep, Clara said. Elias shook his head. No hotel will take us. There is a boarding house at the edge of town run by a widow named Hatcher. She does not care about gossip. Only silver, Mrs. Hatcher was a sour-faced woman who took Elias's coin and gave them a room in the attic. It was small, with a single sloped ceiling and a window that looked out over the alley. There was one iron bed. Elias put the saddlebags down. I will sleep in the stable, he said. No, Clara said. Elias looked at her. Clara, people are already talking. If I stay in this room, let them talk, Clara said. She felt a fierce, reckless defiance burning in her chest. They have already decided what I am. I will not freeze alone in a room while you freeze in a barn just to please the sensibilities of people who would see us dead. Elias hesitated, then nodded. He bolted the door. That night, the town felt like a heavy weight pressing down on the roof. Elias sat by the window, watching the street below. He was jumping at every sound, a dog barking, a door slamming. The crowds, the stares, the proximity of so many people. It was bringing the war back to him. He could smell the prison camp. He could feel the walls closing in. Elias, Clara whispered. She was sitting on the edge of the bed. She put the baby in the center of the mattress, surrounded by pillows. Come away from the window. Elias turned. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. I cannot breathe in here, he said. It is too close. Clara stood up and walked to him. She reached out and took his hand. It was cold and trembling. Look at me, she said, not at the street. Look at me. She guided him away from the window, toward the center of the room where the lantern cast a warm, golden circle of light. She placed his hand on her chest, over her heart. "I am here," she said. "We are here. You are not in a cell. You are with me." Elias let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked at her, and the panic in his eyes began to recede, replaced by something else. Gratitude and hunger. "You are the only real thing in this whole damn town," he whispered. The romantic tension that had been building since the cabin, the charge that had sparked when they kissed during the raid, finally broke. It was not a seduction. It was a collision of two people who were holding on to each other like life preservers in a drowning sea. Elias pulled her to him. This time, he did not hesitate. He kissed her, and it was a vow. He kissed the scar on her lip. He kissed the pulse in her throat. Clara held him, her hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, needing to feel the weight of him, the solid reality of his existence. There was fear in it. Yes, the fear of tomorrow, the fear of the law, but the desire was stronger. It was a claiming. They chose each other, there in the cramped attic room, silently agreeing that if the world was going to burn them down, they would burn together. They fell onto the narrow bed, careful of the sleeping child, and the darkness took them. The next morning, the world arrived with the sound of heavy boots on the stairs. There was a pounding on the door that shook the frame. "Open up," a voice boomed. "Sheriff Rakes!" Elias was out of bed and fully dressed before the second knock, his revolver in his hand. Clara snatched up the baby, retreating to the corner. Elias unlocked the door but did not open it. He stood back, the gun leveled at the waist. "Come in," he said. The door swung open. Sheriff Tom Rakes filled the frame. He was a massive man, bigger even than Elias, with a face that looked like a slab of raw beef. He wore a star that gleamed with polish. Behind him stood two deputies, shotguns held ready. "Put the iron down, Mercer," Rakes said, "or we cut you in half." Elias hesitated, his eyes darting between the men. "Do it." "Elias," Clara said, her voice trembling. "Please." Elias slowly lowered the hammer and placed the gun on the washstand. Rakes stepped into the room. He looked at Clara with a sneer of satisfaction. "Clara Hale," he said, "I have a warrant here for your arrest. Murder of Samuel Hale, flight to avoid prosecution, and theft of property." "I stole nothing," Clara said, hugging her son. "You stole yourself," Rakes said. "You belong to the law now." He gestured to his deputies. "Take her. Wait." Elias stepped forward. "We have a right to see a judge." "We were told Judge Sterling is in town." Rakes laughed. "Judge Sterling is eating breakfast at the hotel. You will see him when I say you see him. Until then, she comes with me for questioning. I am not leaving him." Clara cried as a deputy grabbed her arm. "You are coming," the deputy grunted, dragging her toward the door. The baby began to scream. Elias moved. It was a blur of motion. He lunged for the deputy holding Clara. Rakes was faster. He swung the barrel of his heavy pistol and struck Elias across the temple. There was a sickening crack. Elias crumpled to the floor, blood pouring from a gash in his head. "Elias!" Clara screamed. "Clara!" She fought then, clawing at the deputy's face, kicking, biting. But they were too strong. They dragged her out of the room, down the stairs, and into the harsh light of the morning street. They threw her into a cell in the back of the sheriff's office. It was a stone box, damp and smelling of old urine. They took the baby from her. "No!" Clara shrieked, throwing herself against the bars. "Give him to me! He needs to feed!" Rakes stood on the other side of the bars, holding the crying infant awkwardly. "You want the brat?" he asked. "Give him to me!" Clara sobbed, sliding down the bars to her knees. Rakes pulled a folded paper from his pocket. He held it up. "Sign this." He said, "What is it?" "A confession. It says you got into a rage and pushed Samuel. It says you ran away because you were guilty. You sign this, and I give you the kid. We go to the judge. You plead guilty. Maybe you get 10 years instead of the rope. The kid goes to the Hales to be raised right." "You want me to lie?" Clara whispered. "I want this over," Rakes said. "The Hales pay my salary. Mrs. Hale. They want the mine title clear. A murder conviction clears it." Clara looked at her son. He was turning red. his face contorted with distress. Every instinct in her body screamed to sign the paper, to hold him, to soothe him, but she remembered the bruises on her wrists. She remembered Caleb Hale's hands on her. She remembered Elias bleeding on the floor. If she signed, she was giving the Hales everything, the mine, her life, and eventually they would take the boy anyway. A convict mother could not keep a child. She stood up. She wiped the tears from her face. She gripped the cold iron bars. "No," she said. Rakes blinked. "What did you say?" I said, "No, I will not sign a lie, not even for him. Because if I sign that, I am telling him his mother is a killer. I am telling him that the men who hurt us won." She looked Rakes in the eye, and for the first time, the sheriff looked unsettled. He saw something in her face that he had not expected. He had expected a frightened girl. He was looking at a matriarch. "You are making a mistake," Rakes warned. The door to the office banged open. A voice rang out, sharp and clear. "Sheriff, I believe you are holding my client without counsel." Rakes spun around. Standing in the doorway was a tall man in a black frock coat, holding a silver-tipped cane. It was Judge Sterling, and beside him, swaying slightly, his head wrapped in a bloody bandage, was Elias. But it was the third man who mattered. Behind them stood a small, nervous man in ink-stained sleeves. It was Arthur Penn, the clerk from the mining office. "Judge," Rakes stammered, "I was just conducting an interview." "With a hostage?" Sterling asked, looking at the baby in Rakes's arms. "Give the child to its mother." "Sheriff, now." Rakes hesitated, then handed the baby through the bars. Clara snatched him, collapsing onto the cot, rocking him wildly. Elias stepped forward. He looked like death warmed over, his face gray, blood seeping through the rag on his head. But he was standing. "We found him," Elias rasped, pointing at the clerk. "Tell him." "Arthur," the little clerk trembled. "I have the ledger." "Sheriff, what ledger?" Rakes barked. "The payroll ledger for the Blackwood mine." Arthur squeaked. "It shows payments. $500 to a man named J.T. Miller, the explosives expert. The payment was made the day before Samuel Hale died, and it was authorized by Caleb Hale." The room went silent. "Sabotage," Judge Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave. "That is a federal crime, Sheriff, and if it resulted in death, it is capital murder." Rakes's face turned purple. "This is nonsense." "A clerk scribbles? I have the signed receipt," Arthur shouted. Finding his courage, "Caleb Hale signed it. He paid to have the support beams blown. He killed his brother to get the claim, and he framed this woman to cover it up." Sterling turned to Rakes. "Release her," the judge ordered. "I have a warrant," Rakes growled, his hand hovering near his gun. "And I am the circuit judge for this territory," Sterling thundered. "I am revoking that warrant pending a formal hearing. You will release her, or I will have the marshal arrest you for obstruction of justice." Rakes looked at Elias. He looked at the judge. He looked at the clerk. He realized the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The town's narrative, the story they had built to protect their power, had just developed a crack. He pulled the keys from his belt and threw them on the floor. "Unlock it yourself," he spat. Elias picked up the keys. His hands were shaking, but he managed to slide the key into the lock. The door swung open. Clara stepped out. She did not look at Rakes. She looked at Elias. "You came back," she whispered. "I told you," Elias said, leaning heavily against the bars. "I always come back." Judge Sterling tapped his cane on the floor. "I am setting a hearing for tomorrow morning at the courthouse," he announced. "Mrs. Hale, you will present your evidence. Sheriff, you will inform Mr. Caleb Hale that his presence is required, and if any harm comes to this woman or her witness in the meantime, I will bring the United States Army down on this town." Rakes glared at them. "You have not won yet," he hissed. "A hearing is just talk. You think a jury in this town will convict a Hale? You are dreaming." He stormed out of the office, slamming the door. Elias sagged, his strength finally giving out. Clara caught him, holding him up. "We have to go," Elias said weakly. "He will send men." Judge Sterling shook his head. "You are coming to the hotel. I have 2 federal marshals with me. They will stand guard at your door. Tonight, you are under the protection of the United States government." They walked out into the street. A crowd had gathered. They watched in silence as the battered mountain man and the widow with the baby walked side by side, flanked by the judge. Clara looked at the faces in the crowd. She saw confusion. She saw doubt. The story was changing. But as she looked toward the end of the street, she saw a group of men mounting horses near the saloon. They were heavily armed. She realized then that justice would not come from a gavel. It would come from a fight. They had lit a fuse, and tomorrow the explosion would come. Clara tightened her grip on Elias's arm. "We are ready," she said softly, though only he could hear. Elias looked at her, his eyes glassy with pain, but burning with that same fierce love. "Yes," he said, "we are." The part ended with them crossing the threshold of the hotel, the heavy doors closing behind them, shutting out the staring eyes but not the danger that waited for the dawn. The courthouse in Oak Haven was a drafty timber box that smelled of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the sour sweat of too many men packed into too small a space. It was early December, the year 1874, and the winter light filtering through the grimy, unwashed windows was gray and unforgiving. It cast long, distorted shadows across the floorboards, making the spectators look like a gathering of ghosts. They had come for a show. The town was hungry for it. News of the widow who ran with the mountain man had traveled faster than a telegraph wire, and the benches were filled with miners, ranchers, and bonneted women who held their Bibles like weapons. They wanted to see the sinner. They wanted to see the monster. Clara Hale sat at a small oak table near the front, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were the color of new milk. She wore a simple gray dress that Mrs. Hatcher, the boarding house owner, had lent her. It was too big in the shoulders, making her look frail, but her spine was a rod of iron. Elias Mercer sat beside her. He had cleaned up, though the bandage on his temple was a stark white against his weather-beaten skin. He wore a borrowed coat that strained across his broad shoulders. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at the judge's bench. His jaw set so hard, a muscle jumped rhythmically in his cheek. The whispers behind them were like the buzzing of flies. "Look at her," a woman hissed. "No shame in her eyes. That baby is not Samuel's," a man muttered. "Look at the timing. She was warming another bed long before he died." Clara heard them. Each word was a stinging nettle. She realized then that the law was not just about statutes and gavels. It was about stories. And the story this town had told itself was that a woman who survived alone must have done something wicked to manage it. Judge Sterling banged his gavel. The sound cracked through the room like a pistol shot. "Order," he bellowed. "This is a court of law, not a saloon. The next man who speaks out of turn will spend the night in the ice house." He looked down at the prosecutor, a slick man from the territory capital named Mr. Vance, who had been hired by the Hale family. And then he looked at the defense, which was just Clara, Elias, and the unexpected support of the circuit judge's own insistence on fairness. "Mr. Vance stood up. He smoothed his vest. He looked at the jury. 12 men drawn from the saloons and shops of Oak Haven. "Gentlemen," Vance began, his voice oily, "we are here to discuss a tragedy. A good man, Samuel Hale, is dead, and his widow, instead of mourning, fled into the wilderness with a man of known violent character. We will prove that this flight was not fear, but guilt." He called his witnesses. They were a parade of prejudice. Mrs. Gable took the stand. She smoothed her skirts and looked at Clara with pure venom. She never cried. "Mrs. Gable stated, "not once. When they brought Samuel's body up, she just looked at him like he was a sack of flour she did not order, and she was always proud. Too proud for a woman living in a shack. She refused charity." Vance nodded. "Refused charity? Or refused to let neighbors close enough to see the truth?" Next came a man from the Golden Steer Saloon. "Samuel was afraid of her. The man lied. He told me so. Said she had a temper. Said she threatened him." Elias shifted in his chair, his hands clenched into fists on the table. Behind him, a man kicked the leg of his chair. "Easy there, killer," the man whispered. "Do not go pulling a knife now." Elias turned his head slowly. He looked at the man, a ranch hand with bad teeth. Elias's eyes were flat and cold, the eyes of a wolf deciding where to bite. The ranch hand swallowed and looked away. Elias turned back. He felt Clara's hand brush his arm under the table. It was a light touch, but it anchored him. "Breathe," she whispered. "Do not give them what they want." He exhaled slowly. They wanted him to snap. They wanted the savage mountain man to prove them right. He would not give them the satisfaction. Then it was Clara's turn. She walked to the witness chair. The Bible was placed in her hand. She swore to tell the truth. "Mrs. Hale," Judge Sterling asked gently, "why did you run?" Clara looked at the crowd. She saw the faces of the people who had ostracized her. She saw Caleb Hale sitting in the front row, his face a mask of arrogant grief. "I ran because I wanted to live," Clara said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried to the back of the room. "Tell us about your marriage," Sterling said. Clara took a breath. She stripped away the privacy she had clung to for so long. Samuel was not a monster, she said. He was a man who was disappointed by life. He drank to forget that he was poor. And when he drank, he became mean. He hit me. A murmur went through the crowd. He hit me because the mine was dry. Clara continued. He hit me because the roof leaked. He hit me because I was there. And you all knew it. She pointed a trembling finger at the crowd. You heard the shouting. You saw the bruises on my face when I came to market. You looked away. You sold him the whiskey that made him crazy. And then you judged me for the noise he made. She looked at Caleb Hale. And when he died, his family did not come to comfort me. They came to take the shack. They came to take the few dollars in the jar. They blamed me because it is easier to blame a stranger than to admit your own blood is tainted. Vance jumped up. Objection! The witness is slandering the grieving family. Overruled. Sterling said, Sit down. Mr. Vance. Vance changed tactics. He walked up to Clara, leaning in close. You say you were afraid. Mrs. Hale. Yet you ran to the cabin of Elias Mercer. A man with a criminal record. A man known for violence. Did you know him before? No. Clara said, Are you sure? Vance smirked. A lonely woman. A strong man. It is a familiar story. Is it not true that you and Mr. Mercer conspired to remove your husband so you could be together? Is it not true that the child you hold so dear is actually— That is a lie, Elias roared. He stood up, knocking his chair over. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Sit down. Mr. Mercer, Judge Sterling shouted. He never touched me, Clara cried out, her voice breaking. He saved my life. He's a better man than any of you. Vance smiled. He had what he wanted. The outburst looked like guilt. The afternoon dragged on. The air in the room grew heavy and stifling. It felt as though the walls were closing in, crushing them. Then, the door at the back of the room opened. A man walked in. He was dirty, covered in coal dust, his eyes white circles in a blackened face. It was a miner named Silas Green. He walked straight to the front of the room, ignoring the bailiff. I have got something to say, Green announced. Judge Sterling looked over his spectacles. Who are you? I work the shift with Samuel Hale, Green said, and I am tired of carrying water for Caleb Hale. He pointed at Caleb. This man here, Green said, his voice rough with coal dust. He came to the site the day before Samuel fell. I saw him. He was arguing with the foreman. He said the timbering was too expensive. He said accidents happen. The courtroom went dead silent. And Samuel? Judge Sterling asked. Samuel was scared. Green said, He told me that night. He said he found something. A vein. Silver. Pure stuff. He said he was going to be rich. He said he was going to take his wife and leave this town. Green looked at Clara. He did not hate you, ma'am. He was just weak, but he found that silver. And the next day, the support beam on the high ledge gave way. That was not rot. Judge, that beam was sawn. I saw the sawdust. Caleb Hale stood up. his face red. "This man is a drunk. He is lying. Sit down." Sterling slammed the gavel. Green reached into his pocket. "And one more thing. I found this in the foreman's shack." He held up a piece of paper. "It is a deed transfer," Green said, "dated the day after Samuel died, turning the mine over to the Hale family trust, but Samuel did not sign it. He was already dead." Judge Sterling gestured to the bailiff. "Bring that here." The judge examined the paper. He looked at Arthur Penn, the clerk who was sitting nervously by the defense table. "Mr. Penn," the judge said, "is this your handwriting?" Arthur Penn stood up, shaking. "Yes, Your Honor, Caleb, Mr. Hale made me write it. He said if I did not, I would lose my job. He said the widow was going to prison anyway, so it did not matter." The room erupted. The crowd, sensing the shift in the wind, turned their hunger from Clara to Caleb. The murmurs became shouts of anger. But Vance was not done. He was desperate. "Even if there is a property dispute," he shouted over the noise, "it does not change the character of the man she is with. Elias Mercer is a firebug, a killer. We cannot trust the word of a woman who consorts with such trash." A voice cut through the din. It was calm, authoritative, and sharp as a saber. "I would be careful who you call trash. Counselor." An older man stood up in the back row. He was leaning on a cane, wearing a faded blue coat with brass buttons. It was Captain Joshua Miller, a man who had commanded the territorial militia for 20 years. Captain Miller walked forward, the crowd parting for him. "I know Elias Mercer," Miller said. "He served under me in the 6th Cavalry?" Vance sneered. "A soldier? That proves nothing." "It proves everything," Miller said. He looked at Elias with a nod of respect. "This man was the finest scout I ever had. And about that barn in Wyoming? I know the truth of that, too." He turned to the jury. "Mercer did not burn that barn to hurt anyone. He burned it because the man who owned it had locked 3 fever-sick settlers inside to die because he did not want the sickness spreading to his town. Mercer went in through the flames. He pulled 2 of them out before the roof came down. He burned his hands to the bone doing it." Miller looked at the townspeople. "He took the blame in the beating because he promised the survivors he would not tell the law their names, for fear the rancher would hunt them down. That is the kind of man he is. He takes the hits so others do not have to." Clara looked at Elias. He was staring at his hands, his face unreadable. She reached out and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over and gripped hers tight. It was a lifeline. In the middle of the shouting, the accusations, and the chaos, that grip was the only thing that felt real. The romantic tension between them was electric. It was not the soft romance of poetry. It was the fierce, desperate connection of 2 soldiers in a foxhole. Every glance they exchanged was a promise. "I am with you. I see you." Judge Sterling banged the gavel again. "Court is in recess until tomorrow morning," he shouted. "I will review this new evidence. Sheriff Rakes, take Mr. Hale into custody for questioning regarding the forgery." Chaos broke loose. Sheriff Rakes looked at Caleb Hale, then at the judge. He did not move to arrest his benefactor. Instead, he moved toward Clara. "The child." Rakes barked. "The court is in recess. The child is a ward of the state until the verdict is rendered. Hand him over." Clara stood up, backing away. "No." The judge said, "I am the law here," Rakes shouted. He lunged for the baby. Elias moved. He did not punch. He did not draw a weapon. He simply stepped between Clara and the sheriff like a granite wall. Rakes collided with him and bounced off. "Get out of my way." "Mercer!" Rakes yelled. 2 deputies moved in, swinging batons. Elias caught the first baton in his hand. He wrenched it free and tossed it aside. He shoved the deputy backward, sending him crashing into the jury box. "Run, Clara!" Elias shouted. "Get to the hotel!" The courtroom dissolved into a brawl. Men were shouting, climbing over benches. Captain Miller was using his cane to trip a man who tried to grab Elias. Clara clutched her son and ran. She pushed through the back doors, bursting out into the cold alleyway behind the courthouse. Elias was right behind her, breathing hard, his coat torn. "This way," he gasped. They ran down the alley, slipping on the ice. Behind them, they heard the heavy boots of the sheriff's men. They ducked into the back entrance of the hotel. The federal marshals Judge Sterling had assigned were in the lobby, but the back stairs were unguarded. They scrambled up 3 flights to their room and slammed the door, shoving the heavy dresser against it. Clara collapsed on the bed, her chest heaving. The baby was crying, terrified by the running and the noise. Elias went to the window, peeling back the curtain an inch. "They are outside," he said grimly. "Rakes is gathering a posse. He knows he is losing. If he cannot win in court, he will win in the street." He turned to Clara. He looked exhausted. The fight, the trial, the weight of the past. It was crushing him. "We should have kept running," he said, his voice hollow. "I brought you into a trap." "Clara." Clara stood up. She walked over to the basin and wet a cloth. She went to him and wiped a smear of blood from his cheek. "No," she said. Her voice was steady, startlingly so. She looked at him, and the fear that had defined her life for the last year, the fear of Samuel, the fear of the town, the fear of winter, was gone. In its place was something cold and hard and unbreakable. "I am done running. Elias, Clara, I mean it. If we run now, we run forever. They will take the mine. They will take my name. And one day, they will take my son." She walked to the bed and picked up the sleeping baby, holding him with a fierce protectiveness. "We stay. We finish this. If they want to hurt us, they have to come through that door, and I will not make it easy for them." Elias looked at her with wonder. She was no longer the fragile widow he had pulled out of the snow. She was a force of nature. He sat down on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. "I had a brother," he said into the silence. Clara stopped pacing. She waited. "His name was Toby." Elias said, "He was 6 years younger, soft-hearted. He wanted to be like me. When I joined the army, he followed. I told him to go home. I told him he was not made for it." Elias's voice cracked. "We were pinned down at Antietam, in a cornfield. The fire was so heavy. I told him to stay down. I told him I would clear a path. I moved up. I thought he was behind me, but he got scared. He stood up to run." Elias closed his eyes, the memory vivid and terrible behind his lids. "I heard him get hit. I heard him calling my name. I could not get back to him. The line pushed us forward. I left him there. Clara, I left him dying in the mud calling for me." He looked up at her, tears tracking through the dust on his face. "That is why I went to the mountains. Because everything I try to protect dies. I thought if I stayed away from people, I could not fail them." Clara looked at him. She felt his pain, sharp and deep. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him it wasn't his fault, but she knew that pity was not what a man like Elias needed. Pity would break him. She walked over to him and knelt between his knees. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "You did not kill him, Elias. The war killed him. I left him," he whispered. "And you found me," Clara said firmly. "You found us. You pulled my son into this world with your own hands. You kept us warm when the fire was dying. You stood in front of a sheriff and a mob today." She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "You are not bad luck, Elias Mercer. You are the only luck I have ever had. Do not you dare give up on yourself now. I need you. Toby is gone, but we are here." Elias let out a long, ragged breath. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her shoulder. He held on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a spinning world. "Thank you," he muffled against her dress. They stayed like that for a long time, the silence of the room a shield against the noise of the town outside. Then there was a soft knock at the door. "Who is it?" Elias called, his hand instantly on his gun. "It is Arthur," a timid voice replied. "Arthur Penn." Elias moved the dresser. Arthur squeezed through the crack. He was holding a heavy leather bag. "I stole it," Arthur whispered, his eyes wide. When the fight started, Rakes left his saddlebags on the railing. He opened the bag and dumped the contents on the bed. It was the main ledger, the one Silas Green had talked about. But there was more. There were letters. Letters from Caleb Hale to the sheriff, promising payments. Letters to the mine foreman ordering the sabotage. "It is all here," Arthur said. "Every dirty dime." Clara picked up a letter. Her hands shook, not with fear, but with fury. "This is it," she said. "This is the end of them." She looked at Elias. "Tomorrow," she said, "we give this to the judge." Arthur nodded nervously. I better go, if they find me here. Thank you." "Arthur," Clara said, "you are a brave man." Arthur blushed, looked at his boots, and slipped back out into the hall. Clara and Elias were alone again. The baby was asleep in the drawer of the dresser, which they had padded with blankets. The hotel room was cold. The fire in the small stove had burned down to embers. Outside, the wind howled around the eaves, a lonely, desolate sound. But inside, the air was thick with something else. Elias stood up and locked the door again. He turned to look at Clara. She was standing by the window, the moonlight washing over her pale skin and dark hair. She looked like a queen in exile. He walked to her. He did not ask this time. He did not hesitate. He took her face in his hands and kissed her. It was not the desperate kiss of the cabin, nor the terrified kiss of the attic. This was slow. It was deep. It was the kiss of a man claiming his life back. Clara responded with equal force. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down to her. She wanted to feel his heartbeat against hers. She wanted to forget the court, the sheriff, the snow, the death. She wanted to feel alive. They moved to the bed, shedding the layers of wool and cotton that separated them. There was no shame in it. There was only the urgent, undeniable need to be close, to merge their bodies against the cold and the dark. Elias traced the scars on her back with his fingers, his touch reverent. He kissed the bruises on her soul away. Clara kissed the jagged scar on his face, accepting it, loving it because it was part of the map that had led him to her. In the darkness of that room, with the threat of violence waiting outside the door, they made a sanctuary of each other. They made love with a fierce, grounding intensity, driven by the knowledge that tomorrow might take it all away. Love. Clara realized as she lay against his chest afterward, listening to the steady thump of his heart, was not a soft thing. It was hard. It was a shield. It was the only heat that did not lie. Elias kissed the top of her head. "Sleep," he whispered into her hair. "I will watch." He got up and dressed, taking his chair by the door, his gun in his lap. But his eyes were not empty anymore. They were filled with a terrible resolve. He would not leave her. Not in a cornfield, not in a courthouse, not ever. The part ended with the image of Elias sitting guard in the dark, watching the handle of the door, while Clara slept, her hand reaching out across the empty space of the bed toward where he sat. Outside, the first gray light of the day of judgment was beginning to touch the snow. The gavel came down with a sound like a rifle shot, cracking the heavy silence of the courtroom. It was morning, yet the light filtering through the high, frosted windows was gray and thin, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Judge Sterling sat behind the bench, his face a mask of granite. In his hand, he held the sheaf of letters that Arthur Penn had stolen from the sheriff's saddlebags. "This court is back in session," Sterling announced. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that made the wood beneath the spectators' boots creak as they shifted uneasily. He looked over his spectacles at Sheriff Tom Rakes, who stood near the door with his arms crossed, feigning a confidence he no longer felt. Then the judge looked at Caleb Hale, seated in the front row, his expensive suit looking suddenly out of place in the grimy room. "We have reviewed the new evidence submitted by the defense," Sterling said. He held up a piece of paper. "This is a letter dated November 14th. It is addressed to Foreman Miller at the Blackwood Mine. It reads, 'Structure supports on level 4 are to be compromised. Payment will be rendered upon closure of the shaft. Ensure no witnesses.'" A gasp ran through the room. It was a physical sound, like the air being sucked out of the space. "The letter is signed by Caleb Hale," Sterling said. Caleb stood up, his face crimson. "That is a forgery. That woman wrote it. She is trying to frame me. Sit down," Sterling roared. He picked up another paper. "And this," the judge continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous chill. A letter to Sheriff Thomas Rakes. The widow is a problem. If she is removed, the deed reverts to the family trust. $500 for a swift resolution. $10,000 for the conviction. The judge lowered the paper and looked directly at the sheriff. Sheriff Rakes, you are an officer of the court, yet it appears you are a hired gun. The crowd turned. The mob that had been baying for Clara's blood just 24 hours ago now looked at their leaders with a dawning, horrified realization. They had been used. Their morality, their righteous indignation, their Bible verses. It had all been a puppet show pulled by strings of silver. The shame in the room was palpable. Men looked at their boots. Women adjusted their shawls, refusing to meet Clara's eyes. Arthur Penn, the clerk, stood up near the witness box. "It is true," he squeaked. "I saw the money transfer. I saw the ledger." Caleb Hale lunged toward the clerk. "You rat! I will kill you!" Elias was out of his chair before the bailiff could move. He did not strike Caleb. He simply stepped into his path, his chest acting as a barrier. Caleb collided with him and bounced back, looking up into Elias's scarred, impassive face. "Sit down," Elias said softly, "before you make it worse." Caleb looked around. He saw the faces of the townspeople. He saw the disgust. He saw that his money could buy a sheriff, but it could not buy back the illusion of honor once it was stripped away. He sank back onto the bench, defeated. Judge Sterling cleared his throat. In light of this evidence, the charges against Clara Hale are dismissed with prejudice. The court finds that the death of Samuel Hale was not accidental, nor was it caused by his wife. It was a calculated act of sabotage. He turned to the federal marshals standing by the wall. "Marshals, take Mr. Caleb Hale into custody for conspiracy to commit murder," and Sheriff Rakes backed toward the door, his hand hovering near his gun. "You have no authority over me. Judge, I am elected. I am suspending your authority pending a federal inquiry," Sterling said. "You will surrender your badge." Rakes looked at the crowd. He looked at Elias. He sneered, spat on the floor, and unpinned the tin star. He threw it on the ground. "Keep it," he said. "This town is rot anyway." He turned and walked out, his boots loud on the floorboards. The marshals moved to cuff Caleb, who was shouting for his lawyer. Clara sat still. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Elias. "It is over," he said. Clara looked at him. She looked at the judge. She looked at the townspeople who were now staring at her not with hatred, but with a morbid curiosity mixed with guilt. "Is it?" she asked. The judge signed a document and handed it to the bailiff. "Mrs. Hale, the court affirms the inheritance rights of your son. The Blackwood mine and the silver vein discovered within it belongs to him until he is of age. You are the trustee. It was justice." But as Clara walked out of the courthouse 10 minutes later, clutching her baby to her chest, she realized it was an imperfect justice. Caleb would have expensive lawyers. Rakes was free for the moment. The townspeople stepped aside to let them pass, but they did not apologize. They simply watched, their eyes sliding away when she looked at them. "They do not hate you anymore," Elias murmured as they reached the boardwalk. "But they will never forgive you for showing them their own ugliness." "We are leaving," Clara said. "Now." They went to the hotel to gather their things. Captain Miller met them in the lobby. The old soldier looked grim. "You need to ride," Miller said. "Rakes is at the saloon. He is drinking whiskey and talking loud. He says the law is wrong. He says a woman cannot own a mine. He has men with him. Drifters. Hired guns." "Thank you, Captain," Elias said. Miller handed Elias a box of ammunition. "Watch your back. Mercer, a snake bites hardest when you step on its tail." They packed quickly. The air in the room was tense. The victory in court felt fragile, like thin ice over a deep river. They loaded the buckboard wagon Elias had traded for. Clara sat on the bench seat, the baby wrapped in buffalo robes between them. Elias took the reins. "We go west," Elias said, "toward the gap. If we can make the tree line before dark, we have a chance." They rode out of Oak Haven under a leaden sky. The town was eerily quiet. Shops were closed. The streets were empty. It felt like a stage where the actors had fled before the final act. They reached the edge of town, where the road narrowed and crossed a wooden bridge over the freezing creek. The snow was beginning to fall again. Large, heavy flakes that obscured the distance. Elias pulled the horses up. "What is it?" Clara asked, her hand going to the revolver Elias had given her. "Tracks," Elias said. He pointed to the fresh snow on the bridge. Men had ridden across here, then dismounted. The tracks led into the rocks on the far side. "It is an ambush," Elias said calmly. He looked at Clara. "Take the lines," he said. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to clear the road." Elias grabbed his Winchester rifle. He did not get down from the wagon. Instead, he stood up on the footboard, using the height to scan the rocks. "Rakes!" he shouted. His voice echoed off the canyon walls. "I know you are there. Come out." For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then, a shot rang out. A bullet splintered the wood of the wagon seat, inches from Clara's hip. "Get down!" Elias yelled. Clara threw herself over the baby, shielding him with her body. Elias dropped to one knee. Bringing the rifle up, he fired. A man screamed in the rocks. Rake stepped out from behind a boulder. He was holding a shotgun. 3 other men appeared on the ridge, aiming rifles. "You think a piece of paper stops me?" Rake shouted. "That silver is mine. Mercer, I earned it. I kept the peace in this town for 10 years. He raised the shotgun. Elias did not fire. He looked at the men on the ridge. "You men," Elias called out. "You are fighting for a man with no badge. The marshals are in town. You kill us. You hang. Is Rakes paying you enough to die for?" 2 of the men on the ridge hesitated. They lowered their rifles slightly. "Shoot them!" Rakes screamed. One of the hired guns fired. The bullet struck one of the wagon horses. The animal shrieked and reared, twisting in the harness. The wagon lurched violently. Clara was thrown sideways. She gripped the rail with one hand and the baby with the other. Elias jumped from the wagon. He rolled in the snow and came up firing. He did not shoot to kill. He shot the rock in front of the riflemen, sending stone chips flying into their faces. He was giving them a choice. "Run or die!" Elias roared. The hired men looked at Rakes, then at the wild-eyed mountain man who fought like a demon. They looked at the town behind them. They turned and ran, disappearing into the timber. "Cowards!" Rakes yelled. He turned back to the wagon. He saw Clara trying to calm the panicked horses. He saw his chance. He raised the shotgun, aiming not at Elias, but at her. Clara saw him. She saw the black bore of the weapon. She saw the hate in his eyes. She did not scream. She did not freeze. She reached into her coat and pulled out the heavy Colt revolver. She remembered the lesson in the snow. Feet apart. Squeeze. Do not pull. She leveled the gun. Rakes laughed. "You will not shoot, little lady. You do not have the—" Clara fired. The gun kicked hard, bruising her palm. The bullet struck Rakes in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped the shotgun and fell into the snow, clutching his arm, howling. Elias was on him in a second. He kicked the shotgun away. He stood over Rakes. The rifle pointed at the man's chest. Rakes looked up, his face gray with pain. "Go ahead. Mercer, be the killer they say you are." Elias looked at him. He felt the rage boiling in his blood. He remembered the cell where they beat him. He remembered the threats against Clara. It would be so easy to pull the trigger. The snow would cover it. But then he heard Clara's voice. "Elias!" He turned. Clara was standing by the wagon. She was holding the smoking pistol. She was not looking at Rakes. She was looking at him. "Do not," she said. "He is not worth it." Elias looked back at Rakes. He saw a small, broken man bleeding in the mud. He realized that killing him would only prove Rakes right. It would make Elias a savage. He lowered the rifle. "You are done, Rakes," Elias said. He turned his back on the man. It was the ultimate insult. He walked back to the wagon and checked the horse. The bullet had grazed its flank, a flesh wound. It would heal. He climbed up beside Clara. He took the gun from her hand and gently uncocked the hammer. "You have a good aim," he said quietly. Clara looked at her hands. They were shaking now, the adrenaline fading. I did not want to kill him. I just wanted him to stop. He stopped. Elias said. He snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, crossing the bridge, leaving the moaning ex-sheriff in the snow for the marshals to find. They rode until the sun went down, putting miles between themselves and the town. They camped that night in a grove of aspens, far from the road. The silence of the wilderness settled around them. But it was different now. It was not the silence of hiding. It was the silence of peace. They built a fire. Clara fed the baby, who had slept through the gunfight with the innocence of the very young. Elias sat across the fire, cleaning his rifle. He looked at Clara. "Where do we go?" he asked. Clara looked into the flames. The question hung in the air. "We could go back to the cabin," Elias said. "It is safe there. No one comes up that high." Clara shook her head. The cabin was a refuge. Elias. But it is not a home. A child cannot grow up seeing nothing but snow and trees. He needs a school. He needs to know he is part of the world, even if the world is hard. "Then we go to the city?" Elias asked, though his voice tightened at the thought. "No," Clara said. "Not the city. Too many eyes. Too much noise." She looked at him. "Is there a middle place? A place where we can see the mountains, but where the road still reaches?" Elias thought. He nodded slowly. "There is a valley," he said. "2 days north. There is water, a hot spring that keeps the ground warm in winter, good timber. And it is only a half-day ride to the trading post. We could file a claim, a legal homestead." "A home," Clara repeated. "A home," Elias said. They reached the valley 2 days later. It was as Elias had described, a bowl of golden grass sheltered by towering peaks. A creek wound through the center, steam rising from it in the chill air. They did not build a fortress. They built a house. It took months. The winter was hard, but they met it together. Elias felled the trees, his axe ringing in the cold air. Clara stripped the bark and mixed the mud for chinking. They worked side by side, their bodies hardening, their hands growing rough. They faced the grief that lingered like old snow. Clara mourned the girl she had been before Samuel, the innocence that had been stolen. She mourned the brutality of the world. Elias mourned his brother, and the years he had lost to solitude. But they did not let the grief drown them. They used it as mortar for the walls they built. One evening in early spring, when the first purple crocuses were pushing through the melting snow, they stood on the porch of the finished cabin. The baby, now a sturdy 6-month-old named Toby, after Elias's brother, was sitting on a blanket, chewing on a wooden spoon. Elias leaned against the railing, watching the sun dip below the ridgeline. "It is done," he said. Clara stood beside him. She wore a dress made of calico she had bought at the trading post, and a shawl across her shoulders. She looked at the land. It was theirs, not by theft, not by violence, but by sweat and law. She looked at Elias. The scar on his face had faded to a silver line. The tension that had held him like a coiled spring for so long was gone. "Why did you stay?" she asked suddenly. Elias looked at her. "You know why?" He said. "I need to hear it." Clara said, "I need to know it is not just duty. I need to know it is not just because you are afraid to fail again." Elias turned to face her. He stepped close, blocking out the vastness of the landscape until he was her only horizon. "I stayed because of the silence," he said. "The silence. The silence when you are not there." Elias said, "It used to be peaceful. Now it just feels empty. I stayed because when I look at you, I do not see the war anymore. I see the sunrise." He reached out and touched her face, his thumb tracing her jawline. "I want you, Clara. Not to save you, not to protect you. I want you because the thought of waking up without you terrifies me more than any bullet." Clara let out a breath she felt she had been holding for years. "I love you," she whispered, "and that scares me, because I know how easily things are taken away." "I know," Elias said. He pulled her into his arms. "I know, but we take the risk. That is what living is." He kissed her then. And it was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and promise. It was intimate, a sealing of a pact that went deeper than any marriage license. They stood on the porch of the home they had built, two scarred people who had found a way to fit their broken pieces together into something strong. Fade to black. The seasons turned. The snow melted into rushing creeks. The grass turned green. They planted a garden. Potatoes, carrots, beans. They bought a milk cow. They built a fence. It was not a fairy tale. The work was backbreaking. There were days when the frost killed the seedlings. There were days when riders passed on the road and stared at the homestead with suspicion, whispering about the widow and the mountain man. But they did not hide. When they went to the trading post, they walked with their heads high. When the circuit judge came through, they invited him for dinner. They forced the world to see them not as a scandal, but as a family. One morning, Clara stood in the doorway, holding Toby on her hip. The boy was pointing at a hawk circling in the blue sky. Elias was in the field, turning the earth with a plow. He stopped and wiped his brow. He looked up at the house. He saw Clara. He saw the child. He looked at the ridgeline. He scanned the trees for danger, a habit that would never truly leave him. But then he looked back at the woman in the doorway. He raised his hand in a wave. Clara waved back. The fear was still there, lurking in the shadows of the pines. The memory of the court and the gunfight would always be part of their story. But as Elias turned back to the plow, driving the blade into the earth to make way for new life, Clara smiled. They would defend this every day. She kissed the top of her son's head and watched the man she loved work the ground. It was a hard beginning, but it was theirs. Thank you so much for listening to the story of Clara and Elias. It has been a long journey from the snow-blind peaks of the Bitterroot Range to the warmth of their new home, and I hope you felt every mile of it. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you in the mountains, the city, somewhere across the ocean? Please leave a comment down below and let me know. If you enjoyed this Wild West love story and want to hear more tales of survival, romance, and the rugged frontier, please make sure to subscribe to From Wild West. And finally, I want to hear your thoughts. What did you think of Clara's choice? Do you think justice was truly served? Share your thoughts in English in the comments section. I read them all. Until next time, keep your powder dry.